Fedor Vadimovich Veselov talked much about the power sector. I'll try to shift over to the power sector, although I would like to focus on the overall strategic points towards decarbonization. Fedor Vadimovich gave certain figures, and I have to repeat them. Non-carbon sources are 35% of the total, 19 for nukes, 16 the renewables are 5%, not yet reached. Last year alone, we commissioned nearly 1,200 megawatt. So thermal power plants stand high too, and gas is dominating in the consumption structure from the thermal power plants generation, 75%, coal 23%, 2-3% is oil. So it's 740 million tons of CO2, according to the report on the national cadastre that Russia submits on the biannual basis to the United Nations. Out of those, the emissions from thermal power plants is 477 million tons of CO2 equivalent, 60%. Obviously, this makes it obvious the Minister of Energy, the main counterpart of the Ministry of Economic Development, should focus on exactly that, despite the fact that we already mentioned the Kyoto Protocol before, and we heard about the adaptation plan and the need to move to a less carbon-based economy since 15 years ago. And therefore, the current task we're addressing in the power sector, and of course, if you burn carbon, then you get CO2 as a result. So the main focus that we're making on what we do today for decarbonization, when it comes to thermal power plants, the main focus is on improving energy efficiency. The specific fuel consumption rate was 307, 37.4, 307, as opposed to several percent higher 7 years ago. So in the power sector, Russia possesses one of the cleanest quasi-clean structures of this sector, with a lot of non-carbon or low-carbon sources. If we look at the IEA results, we are better than the United States, for instance, where 60% of the generation comes from the so-called clean sources, 57% in Germany, and less than 35% in China. As Fedor Vadimovich said, natural gas dominates as a source, and it will be there for some time to come, and we are supposed to make gas as efficient as we can in terms of specific consumption. And we focus on two things. Cogeneration should grow, more heat generated by cogeneration. That requires retrofitting of the boilers, and that's the only way of reducing the GHG emissions. As for the figures, our energy efficiency efforts resulted that last year the GHG emissions from thermal power plants was 7.5% relative to 2014. Again, as the consumption grew, last year was not a characteristic year, but the average rate is 2.3% per annum, the rate of reduction. Secondly, we need to focus on the growth of generation by renewables and nukes and hydros, while trying to maintain the balance of interests, if I might put it this way, that is availability. That's the whole interest of the energy system. Targets or objectives. The main objectives that this ministry is guided with come from the strategic documents of the Russian Federation. The forecast and the strategy of low-carbon development until 2050, whose draft was reported, was submitted to the government and would be enacted pretty soon. Looking at that document, and we work with that document considering it part of our agenda, we see that non-carbon generation should reach 102 gigawatts in installed capacity. That's a huge amount. So the trend is quite clear. By 2035, we plan to build, apart from to build 10 more gigawatts of those capacities, of course, depending on the economic trends and the COVID-19 situation. So this is our main target. The main areas of development, the main areas of our efforts, and I don't like the word decarbonization, that's an incorrect term. We are an export-oriented economy, and I don't think we should focus. Let's talk about carbon neutrality rather than decarbonization. So the balance of generation and capture. And this is the paradigm we work in. The main thing, as I mentioned, in generation is improving energy efficiency. In 2019, we launched a program modernization of heat generation. By 2030, 41 gigawatt of installed electrical capacity would be retrofitted. That's about 25 of all heat generation in this country. On top of that, we plan to launch the arrangement of the so-called innovative investments, with providing support to most efficient CCGP to be built and installed, and we address seriously the fluidized bed technology, circulating fluidized bed, which is very good in terms of under combustion, improving efficiency, and therefore the emissions would go down. 10 gigawatt would be added. Gas motor fuel program will be increased. GHG emissions were reduced by introducing gas motor fuel for 10% of the vehicles. Predominantly, that was, how to put it better, the civil vehicles, or what is the better term? Passenger vehicles, rather. But our expectation is 1 billion cubic meters of gas would be consumed more on passenger vehicles. Those are low emission sources that, amazingly enough, account for 30% of GHG emissions into the air, according to the cadaster. Also, we drafted a bill to create in Russia the so-called digital certification of electricity to be done for low-carbon sources. This certification will certify the origin of your electricity. By buying this certificate, you have a guarantee you have a warrant that it was produced using low-carbon or non-carbon sources. In view of the above and measures I've outlined, I would say Russia is not a very green economy that we're striving for being one. And I think if we break down by the sectors of the commitments of the emissions reduction, as things stand today without further restriction of the regulation, then by 2030, the power sector will reach the on-par reduction of greenhouse gas emissions according to our international commitments and the national strategy. To conclude, I would like to point out once again what Fedor Vadimovich said. First of all, we're going to continue to support the discussion of low-carbon sources, including the nuclear generation. Given the position of our Western counterparts, including France, although they are very low, France features very low carbon emissions. Everyone should dream of having the France's figures like they have, but we will insist that the capturing that the forestry-related regulation pertaining to their carbon capture capacity should be reconsidered not only in Russia but elsewhere too. I'm not saying we're not interested in that because Russia has many forests, because greenhouse gases do not know any borders. So it influences every economy and every nation. So please do not misunderstand me. I'm not talking about the leading role of Russia in the carbon capture by forests. However, developing that area is what we're going to do for certain. And that is one of the biggest contributions to be made towards the zero emission or climate neutral economy. And you cannot do that without the forestry to be taken in full account. Thank you. Thank you, Georgy. As a follow-up, I would sum up by saying that if we look at the targets and objectives in the strategic documents, they are not that many, but we have the main goal, the Paris Agreement, 70-75%. From Georgy's talk, it was clear that we have actively worked on the developing of measures needed to achieve that overarching goal.